So I changed this talk late last night. Prior to last night, my idea for this talk was to just share with you some observations about animation and data visualization, because the field of data visualization, like any field or any area of practice, goes under evolutions. And I was just going to share with you some ideas and observations I've been making about animation and data visualization. But something happened yesterday on Twitter that gave me a new motivation for this talk. So yesterday morning, I published a new podcast episode with John Byrne-Murdoch, who is a data journalist at the Financial Times. And John, or as I call him, JBM, published recently what's been known as a bar chart race, which I'll discuss in some more detail in a little bit. So in response to me publishing this podcast, JBM very nicely put out this tweet that said, hey, I'm going to be on the podcast. We're going to talk about this bar chart race along with some animation. And he followed that up with another tweet that said, hey, if you want to learn more about animation, there's some really great research. There's this really nice Medium post by Danielle Fisher at Microsoft Research that you can learn more about some of the things that we talk about on the podcast. Unfortunately then, someone replied to that. A friend of mine by the name of Francis Gagnon, who's a presentation data visualization expert out of Montreal. And I'm not going to try to do the robot voice, but Francis writes in his tweet, kill the animations, the only valid reward is content. Okay, so Francis now gets to become my foil because I wholeheartedly disagree with this statement. Of course content is important. It is important whenever we produce a visualization, whether it be static, whether it be interactive, whether it be in a report, whether it be on a blog post. But animation is the way in which we can communicate information to different types of audience, and we can use animation in very different ways. So what I'm going to do tonight is try to lay out a space, a schematic of the field of data visualization. I'm going to talk about how animations actually still follow a lot of the perceptual rules that we try to follow when we create visualizations. And then I'm going to show you a bunch of different animations to show you how you can use this in your own work. And at the very end, for those of you who are interested in seeing how can I make some of these things, I'm going to show you some tools that you can use as you go forward in your research and publication and communication. So let me start by laying out a schematic of how I view the field of data visualization. So I'm going to think of this in a series of axes. So the first axis here is what I call the function axis. And here visualizations run from explanatory to exploratory. So on the explanatory side are the graphs that most of us probably make, where we are trying to tell our audience about a story or a conclusion or a hypothesis. Exploratory visualizations are ones in which we are asking our user or reader to explore the visualization, to maybe use their finger or click or use a drop down or whatever we want them to do. Now we can think about another axis that's perpendicular to this one that I'm going to call the form axis. And here visualizations run from static to interactive. So static visualizations, they're not active, they're not moving. Interactive visualizations are ones in which there's an exchange of information between the user and the interface. Now somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the middle here are animated visualizations. And this is where I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to focus on a few types of animated visualizations. I'm going to talk about soft transitions. I'm going to talk about social media and gifs that we all know. I'm going to talk about stories. I'll talk about sound, and finally talk about small multiples. But when we put this space together, we end up in we have these four quadrants. Okay? And many of us are used to seeing and even probably creating the visuals that go into these four quadrants. So the top left are static explanatory graphs. That's your your standard bar chart, dot plot, slope chart. Here's the story I'm trying to tell you. Exploratory static graphs, you want someone to take their finger and follow the line and look at the chord and follow the thing that you want them to explore the data. Then below we have the interactive visualizations, right? And here you have online stuff, you click, you drag, you do this, you do that. You can tell a story, you ask someone to explore the data, okay? But animations are unique in some ways because they have aspects of all four quadrants. Okay? And we can combine them in different ways to interact with our audience and engage our audience in ways that maybe some of these other visualization types simply don't allow us to do. So I'm going to base a lot of the research behind my thinking here on Tamara Munzer's great book, Visualization, Analysis, and Design. So Tamara's book is probably one of the better textbooks of data visualization. It's sort of more on the computer science side of things, but it's a great book if you're interested in learning more about the perceptual rules of data visualization, some of the technical aspects behind the creation of visualizations. So Tamara breaks out 3 types of animations in her book. She talks about narrative storytelling, which you could think about as movies, transitions from one state to another, right? So a bar goes from this level to this level, or this point moves from here to here, and then we have video playback. And I'm going to focus mostly on the transitions from one state to another, because those are the types of visualizations I think that are the most common in the field of data visualizations, and the ones in which probably most of us in this room are most used to consuming and also able to create in the long run. So Tamara writes about animation, that animation is extremely powerful when used for transitions between 2 data set configurations because, and I boldface the important part here, it helps the user maintain context. So that's the important thing that you don't necessarily get from a static visualization. If I show you 2 bars, you have to do the work to see how this bar goes from this size, from this length to this length. But an animated visualization actually does that work for you, and you can see the bar grow, or you can see the line move, or you can see the dots change. So let me just also lay out a very, very brief history of data visualization. Like, when I say very brief, I mean like the last 8 years, 6 years, maybe 5 years, okay? So we started with static visualizations. I mean, we've long time before that, right? We had long history of static visualizations. And then about, let's say 6, 7 years ago, we all got very excited because JavaScript started to be easier to use. D3 came about, computers got faster, browsers got better, data got more fun to play with, and we started making interactive visualizations. And then people discovered that we can make people click and scroll and do all this stuff, and we got really excited, and so we made more and more and more interactive visualizations. And then somebody finally realized that nobody clicks on anything, right? That we're all on our phone, and that creating all these interactive visualizations is super time consuming and super expensive. So then we started to flip back to create static visualizations, and that's kind of where we are now. And if I could go back in time, my research agenda would be, let's track all of the major news stories in every major news publication in the United States, and you would see changes in this evolution of the space. Now, somewhere in the middle, again, are animated visualizations. And here again, we've seen a move towards animation, especially over the last, I'd say, 12 to 18 months. And just like Tamara said, we have lots of different kinds of these, and I'm going to break these down even further in a moment. Okay, so like probably many of you in the room, one of the motivations to creating good, effective visualizations and stories is Hans Rosling. One of the greatest storytellers of the last 20 years was Hans Rosling, and he wasn't using very complicated or complex visualizations. He was simply narrating an animated bubble chart, right? Which technically is not difficult to do. Most of us in this room, anyone who has access to Tableau, could go back right now and create Rosling's original visualization. But at the time, this was groundbreaking, that someone would create an animated visualization and narrate it, and of course, with the enthusiasm that only Rosling could have, right? And it's surprising to me that we haven't seen people try to replicate that approach today. We have better tools, we have better platforms, we have even more data, and yet we haven't seen someone like Rosling come around, which is surprising to me, even though when you think all the way back at the root of it, what made his TED Talk and what made his work so viral was not only his enthusiasm, but his ability to animate data visualizations. Now, we should also think that data visualization is not unique as a field of practice. There's lots of ways to communicate information. I recently listened to an episode of the podcast 99% Invisible, and they did a whole episode on the history of taking pictures of food. There's a whole science behind how you take pictures of hamburgers, right? Because you don't just make a hamburger and put it on a plate and take a picture of it, right? If you look back in 1971, this is one of the early McDonald's print ads. If you go back to the late 1960s, this is one of the early television commercials that McDonald's put out. If you really want to creep yourself out, go look for the original Ronald McDonald. It is this is why kids are afraid of clowns. I didn't even put it on here because it's terrifying. It's a clown with a Dixie cup for a nose. It's terrifying, okay? But this is what we have, and now today, this is a sort of commercial that we see all the time, right? Where we're showing close-ups and detailed looks at different types of food because it's an evolution in that field of how we're producing and communicating advertisements for food and restaurants. Okay, so Francis is wrong, okay? It's not about the content. It's always about the content. But in this case, it's not about the content, it's about how we're communicating information. And what we want to do with animation, and what we can do with animation that we can't necessarily do with a lot of these other visualization types, is engage readers and make them happy in ways that we sometimes can't do with like a single static chart, or even an interactive chart where our goal is sometimes to say, here's a bunch of data, go find something. Okay, so we're taking on a different challenge here. So I'm going to start with the bar chart race. So the bar chart race became very popular like yesterday. Okay, so this is how new it is. So the bar chart race works like this. Now, how many people have seen the bar chart race? Okay, good. So this is how the bar chart race works for those of you who haven't seen it. Imagine a bar chart. Okay, everybody knows how a bar chart works, right? The attribute of the bars is encoding the data. What we're going to show you in the bar chart race is about 9 or 10 bars, and what you're going to see is the bars change their rank, right? Because it's going to be ordered from the longest bar to the shortest bar. So the rank is going to change as the lengths change. Okay? So it's a pretty simple, intuitive graphic. And the bar chart race I'm going to show you is one of the first ones that sort of became popular, and it's going to show you changes in populations of cities since 1500. Okay, and this is the bar chart race that John Byrne Murdoch at Financial Times published just a few weeks ago. So I've also sped this up from 2.5 minutes down to half the time. You see we start in 1500. He actually blows that up so you can see it. And you can see here Istanbul is growing in the number of people that are living in the city. We get near the end of the 16th century. Istanbul is going to take over and become the largest city in the world. And you can see below here that the rankings are changing. Right? That cities are moving around. You can see London, Paris, Beijing, and Tokyo. All these, of course, are moving further out as the population grows, and the rankings are changing over time. As we get into the 18th century, we have Beijing at the far end there, and then London starts to grow. As we get towards the end of the 18th century, and we get into the Industrial Revolution, people, you can cheer for your city if you want. As we get into the mid part of the 19th century, you see New York show up there. As the country starts, New York grows and grows and grows. And you can see as we get near the turn of the century, New York starts to become larger and larger. So as you look at this visualization, you can root for your city, right? And you can identify with parts of the bar chart race that you can identify with. I'm from the United States. I see New York show up there. I get pretty excited that, hey, there's New York. Hey, there's San Francisco, and there it goes again, right? So that's how the bar chart race works, okay? Really simple. 2.5 minutes. The original one is 2.5 minutes. Here's JBM's initial tweet, okay? This view as of last night had 19,000 likes. Okay, that's a lot for a data visualization on Twitter, okay? And it's 2.5 minutes long. I mean, think about how much time it takes for you to look at something on Twitter or on social media. 2.5 minutes is a lifetime, all right? So now, you could, of course, make this in different ways, okay? This is a line chart of all of those cities from 1500 out to 2018. That's a bump chart that shows the ranks. Neither of those tell you anything. Instead, you would have to create, for example, this bump chart where I could highlight just a couple of the cities. That's the only thing you get out of it. You would see this for a second and you would move on. This doesn't engage you in the way that the animated visualization does, okay? And I'm not exactly sure why, but I have some ideas, and we're going to come to that, okay? All right, so here's JBM's ingredients for a successful bar chart race. Okay, so if you want to hear more from John, you can listen to the podcast that came out yesterday. But here are his 3 ingredients. So first off, you need the values to change hugely over time. Okay, so you can see in the one that I showed you that we're extending out left to right, or towards the right of the space. We're also moving things around up and down. So there's a lot of change going on, right? If the things don't change a lot, it's not going to engage you. There's not a lot to look at. There's not that's going to grab your attention and bring you in. The second ingredient is a changing cast of characters. So the thing you'll notice in the bar chart race is that we have only 9 or 10 cities, okay? So by having only 9 or 10 cities, the ranking, the cast of characters in those 9 or 10 cities are changing a lot. If I were to show you all of those cities, you would just see things kind of moving around, but it's not going to engage you in the same way because you have the specific movement of these different, let's call them characters in the visualization. And then finally, the audience can get on board quite naturally. Now, when JBM talks about this, he talks about how the graphic itself is fairly intuitive, right? It's a bar chart. We all learn how to read bar charts in like 4th grade, maybe 3rd. My son knows how to read a bar chart. and a scatter plot. He knows how to read more graphs than the normal other kids in his class because he has a dad who, okay, so yeah, you get it. So the audience can get on board quite naturally because it's a bar chart and because we understand the rankings and it's sorted from largest to smallest. I take a slightly different view of this, that what's natural about the bar chart race in this case is that, again, we can identify ourselves in the visualization, right? We can see the cities that we are familiar with. This gentleman over here was like totally cheering when London took over, right? And then New York beat you. I'm not going to say that like, you know, right? But we can identify ourselves in the data. And so in that way, I sort of view this in slightly an expanded view, if you will, that the audience can get on board quite naturally in a way that it makes the data personal to them. And we know that people are going to engage with visualizations when they can see themselves in the data. All right, so here's one of many tweets that I thought was really interesting and sort of crystallizes why animation is so interesting. So this person on Twitter responds to John and says, "I love this and find these evolving plots fascinating, but can't quite put my finger on why." And I think that's sort of the crux of it. Like, there's something about it that draws us in, right? It's all the combinations of things that JBM mentioned. He continues to say, you have to watch for longer than looking at a line graph, which could display the same info and allow easier numeric comparisons. It's weird. Why is the format so engaging? And I think as you watch the visualization, it's one of those things that you can kind of feel, but maybe not necessarily put your finger on it. Okay, so it is about the animation. There is something about the animation that draws us in, that engages us, and keeps us engaged with the visualization in ways that other visualizations simply don't. Right, so there's something about the bar chart race that really drags us in and really gets us excited about it. Okay, so JBM also talks about animation sort of generally on the show. He says the act of sitting there and watching gives you time to immerse yourself in the subject matter. And I think that's really what's driving a lot of this, right? That if you're going to be interested in the topic, if the visualization is going to draw you in because there's design, there's elements of it that are going to draw you in, you are inspired in some ways to watch the visualizations in ways that maybe static visualizations simply aren't going to do. That there's enough content floating by us now every day that it's just another bar chart, it's just another map, it's just another visualization. But you see something move and it's going to catch your eye, and that's the thing that's going to draw you in. So I've been thinking about what makes a good animated visualization. And so I have my own 3 ingredients, and I'm not sure there's only 3, but these are the 3 that I've been thinking about over the last few weeks or months. So I have 3 here. So my first one is the right pacing. So this is obviously really important because we're actually showing an animation that people can't always control. Sometimes these are movies, sometimes these are GIFs. So the pacing is crucially important. Too fast, and it goes right by, and you can't see and trace the patterns. Too slow, and you're like, I'm done, I'm moving on, I got other things to do, right? So the pacing is crucially important. The second ingredient that's important is the right text, okay? Because sometimes we need to annotate the visualization to explain what's going on in the visualization. Sometimes we need to annotate it to explain how you actually read the visualization. So the text needs to be the right length, it needs to be concise, and it needs to be active. So if anyone here, and probably there are many people here who are researchers, you are the worst people to make animated visualizations, right? Right? Researchers don't know how to be concise. And I work with a lot of them, okay? So like Urban is like 500 people. They're the worst at writing headlines, okay? So this is a task that researchers need to learn, which is how to write, basically how to write on Twitter, okay? How to write concise and active. The third ingredient here is on the right platform. And this is something that I think we as content producers don't always think about. That the way people interact with content on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, is very different than the way they interact with content on a website, very different than the way they interact with it in a printed report or in a blog post. So we need to be thinking about these different platforms in different ways because the way we consume information differs depending on what platform we're on. All right, so before I show you a selection of animated visualizations, let me also demonstrate that animated visualizations have a background, are rooted in Gestalt principles. So Gestalt principles is one of the psychological theory that talks about how we actually perceive information. And it's grounded a lot of people in the data visualization field to teach them how to think about creating visualization. So This image here is from, I basically call it a tome, 2 tomes on Gestalt visualizations by John Wagemans and a whole bunch of co-authors. And you can, not in the back, but you can see some of the different principles here. So we have things like similarity of color, right? So things that are the same color draw our attention. Things that are the same size, the same orientation, things that are enclosed together down here that are called common region. These things are grouped together and draw our attention to those parts of the image. So for example, this little bubble plot from Axios that has different occupations in the United States with income on the vertical axis and age on the horizontal axis, our eyes are drawn to particular parts of the visualization because of these Gestalt principles. Because our eyes are drawn to the different quadrants, because there's the blue group there on the top left and the green group there on the bottom left, that circles are the same size, that they're close to one another. These are the things that draw our attention. Similarly, this scatter plot from The Economist, it has these different country areas, these different parts of the world that are grouped together using these little bubbles, so that principle of enclosure draws our attention to those 3 areas and it organizes a space for us. But there's another principle in here that actually applies to animation, and that principle is called common fate. And so common fate, as defined by these authors, is all else being equal, elements that move in the same way tend to be grouped together. So there is a psychological basis for why animations work for us. That if we're going to have groups of bubbles that look the same and draw our attention, a similar thing is true for animations, right? That our eyes and brains are going to work together, that we're going to follow things when they move together on an animation. Okay, so let me draw out some of these different types of animations for you. So I'm going to start with the animation that I've written about many times when it comes to presentation design. And when I see other data visualization people in the field write about animation, this kind of approach that I call layering, that others call reveals or builds. It's not really an animation. Okay, so the way I think about this, if I was giving a talk on the relationship between the job vacancy rate and the unemployment rate, I might start with a graph space like this. I'm going to show you connected scatter plot, which is a totally new graph to a lot of people. They're not really sure how it's going to work. So I'm not just going to throw all the data up on the screen at the one time. I'm going to layer this graph for you. So when I see data visualization people talk about animation, this is how they talk about it. But it's always talked about on a slide. And that's not necessarily the type of animation I'm thinking about. Okay? I'm thinking about animation where I want to tell you a story through the graphics, through the visualization, and maybe on different platforms. So here I could, for example, show you, okay, this is what happened during the recession. You can see the unemployment rate went up and the vacancy rate went down. After the recession, we moved the way back where the unemployment rate went down and the vacancy rate went up. That's this layering approach that I can use for presentations. But that's not really what I'm thinking about. Okay? What I'm thinking about is something that's a little more in-depth and something that engages you in a slightly different way. And I'm going to start here with what I call soft transitions. So this is in some ways a very subtle form of animation. So this is a story that we did at the Urban Institute on racial segregation in Baltimore. And you can see from that first little scroll that we move from the map to the bar chart. There's a slight subtle animation that softens the transition. So what I did in the layering example was I just essentially showed you 3 pictures. Okay? And it doesn't help you, the way common fate works, for you to track the information as we go from one state to another. As you can see here in this visualization, the soft transition softens that movement from the map to the bar chart. And then the transition between the bar chart softens that movement so that you can track the difference or the change from one state to another state. Okay? It's different than having 2 images side by side or layered on top of one another because I'm tapping into this psychological process of common fate to draw your attention from one segment to the next. It's a similar sort of thing here in this tree map that the New York Times published a few weeks ago. On the different Medicare plans, you can see this very simple animation showing the changes from one plan to another. That what we're doing here is it's allowing the reader to see the change as the boxes change shape, that you can move from one plan to the next. Now there's another type of soft transition, and this is from the Wall Street Journal showing support for President Trump. And you can see the soft transition as it moves, as it splits the icons out across the page. So it's not as simple as saying, here's a picture, here's a new picture, here's another new picture. what I'm going to do with these soft transitions is help you see how, in this case, the split is going to occur. Okay? So it's a subtle transition, but this is probably the animation that we're all used to seeing now, maybe even not even recognizing it as an explicit form of animation. I can do that with this visualization, right? I can add an animation because, of course, PowerPoint lets you do wipes and checkerboards. No one should ever do checkerboards or star swipe or anything. But you could do these sorts of animations, and again, the advantage here is you're allowing people to track the change from one point to another in the animation itself. Okay, so then I want to turn to the socials, what I call the socials. Okay, so it's the social media networks and the gifs, which is where we, mostly where we see the gifs is in social media. I actually think after I wrote this, I sort of thought this sounded like a good band name, so I think I'm going to make T-shirts. I think it just works really well. But the thing about gifs is that it doesn't allow you control. Okay, so everybody knows how a GIF works, right? It's essentially just static images just stitched together, okay? So the problem with GIFs is that it doesn't allow you any control over the visualization. So in her book, Tamara writes that giving people the ability to pause and replay the animation is much better than only seeing it a single straight time through. Okay? So because we're not able to have any control over the GIF, we reduce people's ability to actually go through the visualization and replay it and better understand it. But I also think that animation can be key to helping convey content. So this is a 3D visualization of the population of Manhattan as it changes over the course of the day and the course of the week. And if anyone here knows really anything about data visualization, you have certainly heard that you should never make anything that's 3D. Right? Like 3D is bad, it distorts the data, never use those 3D cone things in Excel. This visualization, however, was built for Twitter. And it works really well for Twitter. So I don't need, as this thing flashes by in my feed, I don't need to know how many people are in Midtown versus in Soho, right? This gives me the sense of the breathing of the city over the course of the day and the course of the week. And that's what I want to get as it flies by on my social media feed. Because that's the thing that's engaging me, and that's the thing that I find interesting. This was an example of a series of tweets from the New York Times during the 2016 Summer Olympics that they did, especially for Katie Ledecky, who basically trounced everybody in the pool. But these tweets were amazing. These tweets summarize a whole lot of information in an engaging, animated way, so that you could see how quickly and how fast she won all of these races. Okay. Now, the other thing about animations that you can do, or GIFs I should say that you can do, is you can actually leave the trail on there so that you have the GIF, okay, which we might think doesn't allow people to rewind and fast forward and pause. But when we draw it like this, the way Len Kiefer did, who is the chief economist over at Freddie Mac, what it allows you to do is actually see where the trend has gone and where it's going. Okay? So again, a lot of this just depends on how we are building our visualizations and what we want people to be able to do with it. Now, as another example, I wanted to show this one, and I'm going to show you how this one doesn't necessarily work as well as it does on the website. So this is from Urban. We did a story on what we call 9 charts on wealth inequality. It's a relatively simple piece, but it's a big hit. People love it. It's literally 9 charts on inequality and wealth. This is the tweet, or one of the tweets that we put out. And you can see here that this is an animated GIF showing each of these changes from one year to the next of how this distribution changes. Now I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to show you a video I made of what happens when you actually use the website. Okay, and when you go to the website, you can see here that you can animate the visualization, and you can see the softer transition. Okay, and so the softer transition, what allows you to do is see the movement from one year to the next and how this curve changes that you can't necessarily do in the GIF version. And so I think this lends a little bit of credence to Tamara's point in her book, and that it's not necessarily here about the pausing and the rewinding, but it's about being able to see the smooth transition from one state to the next. Okay, so then we have stories. So now we can tell stories with animations. Now, this is a video that the Coast Guard put out, actually, about the Panama Canal. And I'm just going to let this play for a moment, because I think the animation that's going to come up here in a moment is really quite extraordinary. So now there's a whole bunch of designers in the room who are like, I could have made that look better, right? That are like, that looks like it was built in PowerPoint, right? But like, it's a fantastic animation because it tells you everything you need to know, and it seamlessly moves over this story, right? That it tells you this entire story of how the Panama Canal works in about 35 seconds. Similarly, this is a story that the New York Times did after Notre Dame burned that tells the story of what happened in the cathedral as it burned. And you can see that what they're doing with the animation is trying to bring you into the building. And by moving the building around, you get a different perspective than you might if you just had a series of individual images. And so that's the advantage of this animation, is that we're drawing people's attention where we want it. The last one I want to show you is a sort of oldie but goodie from Aaron Coblin, who showed all flight paths in U.S. airspace over a 24-hour period. You can see in this animated version when it gets to nighttime in the United States, you could see people taking the red-eye flights from the West Coast to the East Coast. And as we get towards the morning, you can see the East Coast wake up with all the flights taking off from the East Coast. And then we move over the course of the day as we sort of move, daytime moves across the country. And then as we get towards the end of the day, you can see folks on the West Coast in San Francisco and Los Angeles make their journeys southwest to Hawaii. So, right, so this tells you a story, right? This tells you a story about U.S. airspace that you might not otherwise get from a static visualization like a bar chart or a line chart, or even in interactive visualizations where, yeah, you could click on the different airports that can highlight things for you, but the animation tells you this entire story without any words, without any actual characters, or any faces, I should say, of people in the visualization itself. The characters are the data. Okay, and then the second to last thing I want to talk about is something that's a little bit newer, which is adding sound to our visualizations. Because we have now taken visualizations from static things that aren't moving or aren't changing to visualizations that are moving, that are engaging us and drawing us in. But we have other senses that we can use. I don't think we're ready to start licking our computer monitors, but it's probably coming. So let me build this up for you. This on the right is a line chart, obviously. This is showing polling results for a political party in Germany. And as you can see here, the basic trend is pretty much a downward trend. Now, if you were to click on the Berliner Morgenpost and saw this line graph, you would have said, okay, that's great, let me scroll on. Now, what if instead they had done it as an animated visualization? If they did that, you might sit there for an extra moment and watch the animation, right? Watch this line chart change over time. Now, what if, in addition to that, they added sound? So my argument here is you are much more likely to watch this finish than you were the previous version, and much, much more likely to watch this than you were the previous version or the static version. That the sound brings you in a way that the simple animation doesn't, and that the static visualization certainly does not. Okay? And that's what's going on with the sound. We're interacting with other parts of our systems. Here's another animated visualization, or a visualization with sound. This is the yield curve from the Financial Times. Now they produced this, which is sort of like, yeah, your eyes got a little wide, right? Like that was my reaction, like, what? But I also want to show you the other visualization that they created where they actually narrated the sound.
These days, you can make music from anything. I'm going to show you how to take 100,000 numbers and turn them into something musical. This is the mysterious music of the yield curve. It's a chart that analysts use frequently to predict what might happen to the economy. And it's actually quite a simple chart. The y-axis just shows the...
So what Alan does in this visualization is he actually narrates how to read the chart and then plays the visualization on top of it. So the sound allows you to see and hear something.
3 months.
I'm going to go because that was loud. So the visualization allows you to see the relationship of the different types of bonds. But what Alan does in that visualization, in that narrated piece, is actually narrate how to read the chart, and then he plays it on top of it. So again, just like I talked about earlier, where sometimes you need to annotate a chart so that people understand how to read it, this becomes even more important when we do animations because things are flying by. And especially with sound, when you want to engage people right from the start, you need to do something special to get them in. Now, the other thing that we can do is start putting just sound only, okay? So I'm going to play you a visualization that The Economist produced on wages for men in Sweden. And then I'm going to pause that for a second. So let me just show you this. So this is the sound version of wages for men in Sweden before and after the birth of a child. Now, if you're anything like me, that was super confusing, okay? Because when I look at this, right, when I see this, I want to see a graph. And I want to see the sound laid on top of the graph. When I see it this way, all I'm seeing is music notes, and it's kind of confusing. But let me show you the original that played on the Economist podcast, okay? So I'm just going to play like the minute for you. Now, without engaging your visual system, you engage with the sound, and I think you engage with the sound in a very different way.
So it's kind of about both personal histories and public policy stuff.
Yes, and I can show you these differences.
Show me, you say?
This node represents the average salary of a Swedish father-to-be 1 year before having a child. Each following lower node represents a drop of 1%. After 5 years, the average father's salary has gone back up to its pre-child level and beyond.
And so what about Swedish mothers? How does the motherhood penalty look for them?
So in Sweden, after 10 years, a mother's salary goes from here to here. That's a drop of 27%.
So I think in this case, the platform is really important, right? Because at least in my perspective here, there's a conflict between the visual system and the oral system when I'm watching the previous one. But when my oral system is working all by itself, I can clearly hear what's going on in the data, right? And I'm not having this confusion by seeing music notes that should be data or data that should be music notes, okay? So again, the platform, having the right platform is crucially important to this discussion. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is small multiples. And so if you know anything about small multiples, you know that they are exactly what they sound like. They are small multiple graphs. But small multiple graphs can also act as animated visualizations. So Tamara writes, for tasks requiring detailed comparison across any frames, seeing all the frames at once, side by side, can be more effective than animation. So there are lots of ways to do small multiples. This is probably my favorite small multiple. This is by Edward Muybridge in the late 19th century. So Muybridge was asked to prove that when horses run, they actually leave the ground. Okay, and so what he did was he set up rapid cameras to collect the data, and you can see there in the top middle panel there that the horses actually do leave the ground. And of course, Muybridge made an entire career out of taking pictures like this, rapid action pictures. I won't show you the naked humans because it's a little awkward, but the ostriches are pretty cool. But we can obviously do this with data visualization. We can do this by comparing maps. This is one from New York Times showing drought around the country. This is another one from the New York Times on ice extent in different national parks. And this is also from the New York Times on showing, these are tree maps of different panelists in different medical fields, I believe. But then we could also show time. So this is the household income distribution over time in different states, putting these bar charts within a tile grid map. And you could also show the change in voting behavior in the US Congress. This is obviously Democrats and Republicans at the top 1949 and at the bottom 2012. I haven't seen the 2018 version, but presumably you need two different screens to do this. But again, all of these small multiples allow you to see these changes over time in ways that maybe the animation doesn't do. Now, is that better or is it worse? It depends on your goal. So Francis's whole thing was that the animation is bad because it should be about the content. My argument is that sometimes it's about getting people into the visualization. So Danielle Fisher, who his team over at Microsoft, they did this really great study on comparing animation to small multiples, and he writes that whether they had interactivity or not, users in the animation condition were less accurate than small multiples. Okay, so their perception of the data was less accurate. But sometimes accuracy is not our goal. Okay, if any of you, how many people have read Alberto Cairo's books on data visualization? Okay, so these three and the Alberto Cairo graduate student. So hi, Alyssa. Okay, so in Alberto's book, if you don't have Alberto's books, you should get Alberto's books. They're great. Okay, so in Alberto's book, he has this great diagram that's been repeated in lots of different places and lots of different research. And what this diagram shows is at the very top, graphs that enable us to make the most accurate estimates. So you can think about it as like a bar chart. Okay? A bar chart allows us to see that this bar is 2.6% and this bar is 2.1%. Okay? Well, as we work our way down this ranking, we get into graphics that enable us to make more general estimates. So these might be things like pie charts or charts that use 3D or volume or cubes or even color, right? So if I tell you this thing is purple and this thing is red, that doesn't mean that one is bigger than another, right? So those types of graphs enable us to make more general estimates, okay? So whether we're enabling people to make more accurate estimates or not depends on our purpose. In an academic journal, I really want people, those readers, to see that this thing is 2.6% and this thing is 2.1%. But maybe when I'm putting out content on Twitter, I just want people to see that this thing is bigger than this thing. So whether accuracy is important depends, again, on the platform and on the audience. One final piece from Urban. This is just a piece from our Justice Policy Center that shows changes in population and prison reform in states over time. And so what it has is a combination of animations and the small multiples. Because what it has is within, let me go back. We have within each of these states, we have a little line chart that animates. So you can make comparisons both over time, within state, and across state. Okay, so do we want to make users happy or do we want to help them be effective? And this is a question that we have to wrestle with. And it doesn't mean that there's one answer for every platform, for every project, for every report. Because sometimes what we want to do is create output for a particular audience in a particular place where we want them to dive into the 30-page PDF and get all the raw, gory details. Sometimes we just want them to see, hey, this is a really cool 3D column chart of the population of Manhattan. Let me go learn more. It depends what our goal is. Okay, so before I wrap up, for those of you who want to create some animated visualizations, there are ways to do so. First off, the gifs. I call them gifs. I know the thing is now GIFs. I'm sticking to gifs. That's it. I've made my decision. I'm sticking to it. So there's lots of great tools out there. Obviously, Giphy is the most sort of the most popular way to make GIFs if you need to use an online tool. I actually like this one, gifmaker.me. It's really easy. You just take your pictures and just put them in there and click Make Me a GIF, and you're done. You can also do this in PowerPoint. So if you're making, just drop your graphs into PowerPoint and then click Save this out as a GIF, and you're done. Okay, so there's lots of ways to make these GIFs. Again, it's just a cartoon. Okay, so you just need to make these different photos, different images, and then splice them together. If, of course, you're fancier than I am, you could use Photoshop or you could use other tools. But these are the ones that I use pretty much on a daily basis. Okay, if you want to make a bar chart race, okay, you just need to have data and you can just load it into any number of tools. So this is the bar chart race from Flourish. So flourish.studio is a relatively new tool. And once JBM made his bar chart race, Flourish was like, hell, you can do that in our tool. We'll make it easy for people. So you just go there, you open up your data, and you can make your bar chart race and you're good to go. JBM also open sourced the code that he used to create his bar chart race in Observable with his a JavaScript framework. But you don't really necessarily need to be a JavaScript programmer to use the Observable. Okay, you essentially load up your data and you're set to go. Okay, animation sort of more generally. If you're a programmer and know how to use R and ggplot2, ggAnimate is the tool. It's super easy to use. You just load it and you're basically, I see some people nodding, super easy to use. You just load it and you go. I have never used this, but there is an add-in called E2D3 that will export your graphs from Excel into JavaScript. I've never used it, so I can't vouch for it. But there's apparently a way to make animated visualizations directly out of Excel. And then, of course, we have the various tools and sites and resources. So there's the sort of standard, there's a lot of dashboarding tools like Power BI and Tableau. There's also tools like Data Wrapper and Raw and HighCharts. All of these you can use to create different animated visualizations. And it depends on your comfort level with coding versus using drop and drag tools, using things on your desktop versus things that you might use in the browser. Okay, so let me wrap up by going back to this, because I think this is really the key, is what do we want to enable our readers to do, or our users to do? Do we want them to be happy, or do we want them to be able to pick out specific estimates? I think in many cases, we want people just to be happy. We want people to quickly learn something from a visualization. And again, this depends on our goals, and it depends on the platform that we're using. I'm not putting on regression results, right? I'm not putting in appendix table 1 on Twitter, right? Because first off, no one reads it when it goes on your slide. Just as a total side, I can see the researcher brains in the room. Like when you put appendix table 1 on your slide with the 5 columns and the 40 coefficients, right? Like how many times have you seen that? Like a million? It's the new DC Office, but still it's the same old song. Like no one reads that. And so I'm not going to put that on Twitter. But I could put an animated visualization on there to make people happy, right? And to engage them in a way. And maybe that brings them to the more in-depth content that I want them to read later on, okay? So I don't agree with this, okay? I don't agree that it's always necessarily about the content. Of course the content is important. That goes without saying for everything. But animations are a way to engage people, to bring them in. They accord with some of the Gestalt principles, and they can make people happy, okay? So I'm going to finish here with this quote from JBM, because he's helped me refine a lot of my thinking in this area. And I think that what he says here is very true, that the act of sitting and watching an animated visualization goes by allows you to immerse yourself in the subject matter. And this is something that occurs because we take the time out to watch these visualizations finish, which we don't necessarily do with a static visualization. And it's something we don't even necessarily do with an interactive visualization, because if we can't find the answer right away, we move on to the next thing. And animated visualizations, I think, have the power to do that. And because the tools and browsers and computers are getting more and more powerful, we all are going to be able to make these visualizations, not just the JavaScript programmers around the world. So I hope this is helpful. I'm hopeful that we will see more great animated visualizations, and I hope that you'll be able to make them as well. Thank you.